I woke up one morning, scrolling through Craigslist, desperately seeking a roommate to help with the rent. I thought if I find someone that already has a place and needs a roommate, it would cost me less per month and I could save for my own place. After a few inquiries and dead-end responses, I found an ad that seemed perfect. The poster, let's call him Jack, claimed to be a quiet, responsible individual looking for someone to share his apartment. We met in a nearby cafe, and Jack seemed normal enough. He was friendly, easy to talk to, and the apartment he showed me was clean and well kept. I moved in a few days later, optimistic about the new arrangement. The first few weeks were pleasant. Jack was polite, kept to himself mostly, and our schedules rarely overlapped. However, as time passed, subtle changes in his behavior emerged. He'd stay up all night, pacing the apartment and whispering to himself. I could hear muffled conversations from his room, and it unnerved me. One night, I woke up to the sound of Jack talking frantically on the phone. His voice was strained, almost panicked. I couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in his tone sent shivers down my spine. Things escalated when I discovered bizarre scribblings in his room. Pages upon pages filled with nonsensical phrases, strange symbols, and drawings. It seemed like he was obsessed with something, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that it was dangerous. The apartment started to feel suffocating. Jack's odd behavior was taking a toll on my mental health. I decided to confront him, but as soon as I brought up his bizarre actions, his demeanor changed. He grew defensive, accusing me of invading his privacy. That night, I heard noises coming from his room, scratching, knocking, and guttural whispers. Fear knotted in my stomach, but I hesitated to intervene. I couldn't shake off the unease and decided to stay elsewhere for the night. Upon my return the next morning, I found my belongings scattered. It was as if someone had ransacked my room. Panic surged through me. I confronted Jack, but he simply shrugged, claiming he knew nothing about it. Things took a chilling turn when I discovered a hidden compartment in the apartment. Inside, there were objects that sent shivers down my spine, sharp tools, occult-looking items, and photographs of me sleeping. My heart pounded with fear and confusion. I was living with someone who seemed to be fixated on me, someone whose intentions were becoming increasingly sinister. I confronted Jack once more, demanding answers. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. He chuckled softly, a chilling sound that echoed through the apartment. He muttered something about an experiment and the need for a willing participant. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay there a moment longer. I packed a few essentials and left in a hurry, the feeling of dread trailing behind me. I contacted the authorities, reporting the unnerving situation, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. I found a new place to live, far away from Jack and his disturbing obsession. But the fear lingered, the paranoia of being watched, and the dread that I was still somehow entangled in his twisted plan. It took me a long time to regain a sense of security. I changed my routine, avoided crowded places, always looking over my shoulder, haunted by the thought that he might still be out there, fixated on me. The experience left me scarred, mentally and emotionally. It shattered my trust in people and made me question every new encounter. I was scrolling through Craigslist, looking for a side gig to earn some extra cash. I stumbled upon an ad that said, looking for assistance in moving heavy items. Willing to pay cash. Sounded straightforward, and I needed the money, so I responded. We agreed to meet at a local storage facility. When I arrived, a guy in his mid-30s greeted me. He seemed normal enough, just someone needing a hand with moving. He had a truck parked nearby, and he asked if I was up for some heavy lifting. I said sure, thinking it'd be easy money. We went inside the storage unit, and that's when things got weird. There weren't any furniture or boxes. It was empty, except for this weird-looking metal trunk. He asked me to help him move it, but something felt off about it. It was old and rusty, like it hadn't been opened in years. I hesitated, but he insisted it wasn't heavy. We grabbed either end, and as we started moving it, I heard something shuffling inside. It was faint, like someone or something was moving around in there. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. The guy noticed my reaction and laughed it off, saying it was probably just junk shifting inside. But the noise sounded more deliberate than that. It was unsettling, and I was starting to feel really uneasy about the whole situation. I tried to make an excuse to leave, but before I could, the guy locked the storage unit door. He turned to me, and that's when I saw a glint of something unsettling in his eyes. It sent a chill down my spine. I demanded to leave, but he just chuckled and pulled out a knife, telling me I wasn't going anywhere. Panic surged through me, and I tried to reason with him, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the trunk. He muttered something about needing my help to open it, claiming there was something valuable inside. I didn't want any part of it. I tried to run, but he grabbed me and dragged me towards the trunk. I was terrified. I didn't know what was in there or what he planned to do with me. I struggled, but he was stronger. Just as he was about to open the trunk, a security guard passing by heard the commotion. The guy panicked and ran off, leaving the trunk behind. The security guard helped me out and called the police. When they opened the trunk, they found something horrifying: a person, gagged and bound, barely conscious. The guy had kidnapped someone and was about to do who knows what. I was in shock, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't stick around for much longer after the police arrived. It was a close call, and I felt lucky to get out of there alive. I later learned that the guy had a history of criminal activity, and the person in the trunk had been reported missing. It was a nightmare, something I never thought I'd experience. Meeting a stranger from an online ad turned into a life-threatening situation. It made me realize how dangerous it can be to trust strangers, especially in situations like that. I've become more cautious since then, always double-checking before meeting someone from the internet. It's not something I'll forget anytime soon. I found myself on Craigslist, going through listings for video game consoles, hoping to find a good deal. That's when I stumbled upon an ad that interested me, a person offering to trade their console for some rare trading cards that I happen to have. It seemed like a great opportunity to score the game's console without spending too much money. I had 3 out of the 5 cards he wanted, so we agreed for the 3 cards and $50 in cash for his console, and we agreed to meet at a local coffee shop to make the trade. On the day of the exchange, I arrived a few minutes early, eager to seal the deal and get my hands on the gaming console. The seller was already there, sitting at a corner table, glancing nervously around the room. They looked uneasy, constantly checking their watch. I approached them, offering a friendly greeting, but their response was brief and slightly distant. They seemed on edge, their eyes darting around as if they were expecting something or someone. I tried to engage in small talk, hoping to ease the tension, but the conversation felt strained. As we discussed the trade, I noticed the seller's behavior becoming increasingly erratic. They kept shifting in their seat, avoiding eye contact, and seemed reluctant to talk about the trading cards. I sensed something was off, but I brushed it off, attributing it to their nerves or perhaps a shy personality. As the conversation progressed, the atmosphere grew more uncomfortable. The seller started making cryptic remarks, vague statements that didn't quite make sense. They muttered about needing to complete the collection and how time was running out. Alarm bells rang in my mind, but I tried to keep the situation under control, remaining polite and calm. Then, things took an unexpected turn. The seller abruptly stood up, their demeanor changing entirely. Their gaze turned intense, locking onto me with an unsettling fervor. Their voice dropped to a chilling whisper as they uttered incomprehensible phrases about a sacrifice and necessary steps. Panic surged through me as I realized something was seriously wrong. I attempted to step back, but the seller lunged forward, blocking my path. Their eyes held a frenzied glint, and fear gripped me like a vice. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing for a way out. Without a moment's hesitation, I made a dash for the exit, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The seller pursued, their steps echoing behind me. I sprinted through the crowded cafe, desperate to escape the impending danger. I managed to burst through the door and sprinted down the street, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached a safe distance, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced back, but the seller was nowhere in sight. Shaken and terrified, I realized how close I had come to a potentially life-threatening situation. I hurriedly called the authorities, explaining the bizarre encounter and the unsettling behavior of the seller. The police assured me they would investigate the matter, but warned about the dangers of these online transactions and meeting strangers in secluded places. That chilling experience haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread, the fear of what might have transpired if I hadn't managed to escape. It was a stark reminder of the lurking dangers hidden behind seemingly innocent online deals, a lesson I learned in the most terrifying way possible. From then on, I vowed to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to approach online transactions with utmost vigilance, knowing that danger could lurk behind any promising offer. I've always been into buying stuff online, and Craigslist seemed like a good spot for bargains. Found some great deals, scored cool items, and met some decent folks. But there was this one time things got really freaky, and it wasn't because of some haunted item or weird cult, it was a relentless scammer. It all started when I was looking for a used phone. Saw an ad with a pretty sweet deal and decided to hit the seller up. Nothing too fancy, just wanted to make sure the phone worked fine before sealing the deal. The guy seemed legit, at least that's what I thought at first. He agreed to meet up at a nearby park. As I was waiting, I received a text saying he had to cancel due to some emergency. Kind of frustrating, but I figured things happen. But then, he started getting super pushy, insisting on doing the deal online. Red flag, right? I told him I wasn't comfortable and preferred to check the phone in person. That's when things went south. He started sending non-stop messages, pressuring me to send money via some sketchy online payment service. It felt off, like he was trying too hard to make the deal happen, you know? I decided to cut off communication, thinking that would be the end of it. But boy, was I wrong. The guy wouldn't quit. He created fake profiles, bombarding me with messages, emails, and calls, using different numbers each time. It felt like he was everywhere, like he knew too much about my life. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking he'd eventually give up. But the messages got personal, talking about things only someone close would know. That's when the fear crept in. How did he get my info? Was he watching me? It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, constantly looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. And then, it escalated. He somehow got a hold of my address and started sending letters. Each one felt like a threat, like he was inches away from invading my home. I tried contacting Craigslist and the authorities, but it seemed like a dead end. They couldn't trace the guy, and I felt helpless. The more I resisted, the more relentless he became. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The scariest part was when he somehow found out where I worked. He'd send emails to my colleagues, pretending to be a client, asking personal questions about me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like my whole life was an open book to this stranger. The constant fear and anxiety took a toll on me. I'd jump at every unexpected noise, constantly checking locks and windows. It was like I was living in a horror movie, but there was no script, no heroes, just me and this faceless stalker. I started disconnecting from everything, changed my number, deleted social media accounts, moved to a new place. But no matter what I did, the messages kept coming. It was relentless, like he was toying with me, enjoying my fear and panic. I couldn't trust anyone. Every stranger on the street felt like a potential threat. I'd go to sleep with a hammer under my pillow, my heart racing at every creak of the floorboards. It's been a while now, and the messages have slowed down. Maybe he got bored or found someone else to torment. But the fear still lingers. The thought of that unknown person out there, somewhere, who knows too much about me, it's chilling. I've become paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, questioning everyone's intentions. The sense of security I once had is gone, replaced by this constant dread that he might resurface at any moment. This experience changed me. I don't trust easily anymore. I've become cautious, even paranoid, always checking my surroundings, always on edge. I needed a ride to a nearby town, so I checked Craigslist for a ride share. Found a guy offering the service, seemed cool from the messages. We agreed on a time and place for pickup. When he arrived, everything seemed okay, normal car, polite guy. We started chatting as he drove. But something felt off, a bit too friendly, kept asking personal stuff, and I wasn't comfortable. I tried to brush it off, but then he took a different route, said it was faster. Alarm bells went off in my head. I asked about the route change, and he got kinda defensive, said he knew a shortcut. But it felt wrong, like he was going somewhere else. My gut told me something was up, so I texted my friend the car's plate number just in case. The atmosphere got tense, my heart pounding, but I tried not to show it. I asked to stop for a bathroom break at a gas station. He hesitated, but finally pulled over. As soon as I got out, I texted my friend about the situation. I tried to stall, stayed longer in the bathroom, pretending to make calls, anything to buy time. When I got back to the car, he seemed agitated, eyes darting around. My friend texted back, said they called the cops and told them my location. I felt trapped, like the situation was spiraling. He started driving faster, ignoring my requests to slow down. I was scared, not sure what he'd do next. My phone buzzed with texts from my friend, asking if I was okay. The tension in the car was thick, and I could sense danger. I had to think fast. I faked a phone call, told my friend on the line that I was with the police, describing the car and the driver. I hoped it'd scare the guy into stopping. He looked at me, eyes wide, and then abruptly pulled over. I scrambled out of the car and pretended to talk to the police loudly. He stared at me, muttered something, and sped off. I breathed a sigh of relief, shaking. I called my friend, told them I was safe, and asked them to stay on the line until I reached a safe spot. I found a nearby store and waited, still shaken. The cops arrived shortly after, took my statement, and assured me they'd look into it. I couldn't believe how close it was, how easily it could have turned into something worse. I shuddered, realizing what could have happened if I hadn't acted fast or if my friend hadn't called the cops. I learned a lesson that day, to trust my instincts, to stay alert, and to be cautious, especially with strangers. The experience left me shaken, knowing how easily things could have gone terribly wrong. It's a ride I'll never forget, a reminder to always be careful out there, especially when dealing with strangers, even if it's just a simple ride share. I needed to sell my old TV, so I put it up on Craigslist. Got a message from this guy, let's call him Tom, seemed interested. We agreed on a price, but then Tom started asking a lot of questions, personal stuff I didn't feel like answering. I politely told him the TV was still available and left it at that. Tom wouldn't stop messaging, asking when we could meet up. I said I was busy, but he kept insisting, offering to pay extra. It felt weird, so I told him I'd let him know if anything changed. He kept texting, bombarding me with messages, and it was getting annoying. I didn't want to sell to him anymore, but he wasn't getting the hint. Every time I checked my phone, more messages from him popped up, asking about the TV, even late at night. I started feeling uneasy. His persistence was unsettling. I ignored his messages, hoping he'd back off, but he didn't. The next day, he texted again, saying he was in my neighborhood and asked if we could meet up right away. I didn't respond. Later that day, I heard someone knocking on my door. I peeked through the peephole and saw Tom standing there, looking impatient. I froze, wondering how he found my address. I didn't invite him, and I didn't want to see him. He kept knocking, calling my name, saying he just wanted to talk about the TV. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. He started banging on the door, insisting he knew I was home and that he wanted to make a deal. I panicked, feeling trapped in my own home. I didn't know what to do. He wouldn't leave, and I was scared to confront him. I called a friend, but they didn't pick up. The banging continued, louder and more aggressive. I felt my heart racing, hands shaking. I didn't want any trouble, but Tom wasn't giving up. I texted him to leave, but he ignored it, still pounding on the door, demanding to talk. I contemplated calling the police, but I hesitated, not sure if it was enough to involve them. I was alone, feeling helpless and scared. Tom's persistence was unnerving, and I feared for my safety. Suddenly, the banging stopped. I peeked through the peephole again and saw Tom had left. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was over. But then I heard him shouting outside, saying he'd be back, that he wouldn't give up. I felt a chill down my spine, realizing this wasn't going away. I locked all the doors and windows, feeling trapped in my own home. I didn't sleep that night, staying alert, fearing he might return. The next day, I called the police and told them about the situation. They took it seriously and advised me to file a report. I did, feeling a bit safer knowing they were aware. For a few days, things were quiet, and I hoped it was finally over. But then I started getting anonymous calls and messages, strange numbers that hung up when I answered. I felt paranoid, wondering if it was him. I changed my number, blocked all unknown callers, but the messages kept coming. I felt like I was being watched, like I was never really alone. I didn't know what Tom was capable of, and that scared me the most. I stayed at a friend's place for a while, hoping to escape the constant fear. It helped, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being followed, that Tom was still lurking somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike. I never found out what he wanted or why he fixated on me. The whole experience left me anxious, always looking over my shoulder, feeling unsafe even in familiar places. I still checked my doors and windows multiple times, afraid he might show up again. I learned to be cautious online, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate someone's persistence. It was a nightmare I wished I'd never experienced, a reminder that some people out there can be unpredictable and dangerous. I was trying to sell my old sofa. Put an ad on Craigslist, hoping to find a buyer. Got a message from this guy interested in buying it. He said his name was Jackson, but people call him Jack for short. We agreed on a price, set up a time for him to come over and check it out. Jack seemed normal in our messages. We arranged a meetup at my place. I gave him the address. He said he'd be there later in the afternoon. I cleaned up the sofa, making sure it looked good for him. The time came, and I waited for Jack. Someone knocked on the door. I opened it, thinking it was him. But it wasn't. It was someone else, a stranger asking if the sofa was still up for sale. I was confused, told him Jack was coming to see it. The stranger insisted he wanted to check it out too. I felt a bit uneasy, didn't want to let him in. But he was pushy, saying he came all the way and just wanted to have a look. I let him inside, feeling a bit nervous. He walked around, checking the sofa, but he seemed more interested in looking around the place. I started feeling uncomfortable, wishing I hadn't let him in. He asked a lot of questions, personal stuff that felt intrusive. I tried to be polite, but I wanted him to leave. He was lingering, getting too close for comfort. I made excuses, said I had to go somewhere, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about how nice the neighborhood was, how safe it seemed. I felt uneasy, wondering why he was saying those things. He asked about my routine, when I usually leave the house. It felt odd, like he was prying into my life. I started feeling scared, realizing I didn't know this guy. He was too curious about my place, asking about security, if I lived alone. It all felt wrong. I told him I had to go, that I needed to lock up. But he wouldn't budge. He stood there, staring at me, smiling in this creepy way. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to upset him or make things worse. I tried to keep calm, but I was shaking inside. He suddenly got closer, way too close. My heart raced, feeling trapped in my own home. I wanted him out, but I was too scared to confront him. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned knowing details about my schedule, things he should know. I felt a chill down my spine, realizing he'd been watching me. I had to get him out. I tried to stay calm, telling him I needed some air, that he should leave. But he just laughed, saying he wasn't going anywhere. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my phone and pretended to call someone. I acted like I was talking to a friend, telling them about my day. I hoped it would make him uncomfortable and leave. But he wasn't fazed. Instead, he got closer, grabbed my phone, and turned it off. I was terrified, didn't know what he was planning to do. He moved toward me, blocking my way. I panicked, trying to push past him, but he grabbed my arm, holding me back. I screamed, hoping someone would hear. He covered my mouth, telling me to be quiet. I fought back, tried to kick and push him away, but he was stronger. He forced me to the ground, his grip tightening. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was overpowering me. I felt helpless, scared for my life. I wished I hadn't let him inside. Then, there was a sudden knock on the door. He froze, looking startled. I took advantage of the moment, pushed him away, and ran for the door. It was a neighbor asking if everything was all right. I screamed for help, told them to call the police. The stranger bolted, ran out the back door. I was shaking, crying, feeling terrified and violated. The police arrived, took my statement, but the stranger was gone. I was scared he might come back. I changed the locks, got security cameras, and was always on edge. The whole experience left me traumatized, always looking over my shoulder, scared of who might show up next. I never sold that sofa. It was a nightmare I wish I'd never gone through. My name is Marcus, and I am a retired math teacher. In my spare time, I started tutoring online. Put an ad on Craigslist, offering tutoring services for students needing help with math. Got a message from a person, a young girl around 15 years old. She needed help with algebra, said she was struggling in school. We agreed to meet at a local library for the tutoring sessions after she insisted she couldn't do online lessons. She seemed okay in her messages, but something felt off. She was a bit too insistent on meeting in person, even though I usually tutored online. I said I would meet in a public place, but she would need to cover my travel costs. The first session started all right. She seemed eager to learn, but she was fidgety and looked nervous. I tried to make her feel comfortable, went through the basics of algebra. She was restless, kept looking around, like she was expecting someone. I asked if everything was all right, but she just said she was fine. As we continued, she started asking personal questions, things that weren't related to algebra. I felt uncomfortable, but tried to steer the conversation back to the subject. The second session was weirder. She seemed more distracted, looking over her shoulder every few minutes. She was twitchy, kept tapping her foot. It was like she wasn't there to learn at all. I wanted to stop the sessions, but I didn't want to leave her hanging. I decided to give it one more try. The third session was the worst. She was on edge, acting more strange than before. She wasn't even trying to focus on the algebra. Instead, she kept talking about random things, asking about my personal life. I felt uneasy, thinking she wasn't here for tutoring. I wanted to leave, but she didn't seem to get the hint. Suddenly, she pulled out a knife from her bag. My heart sank, and I froze in fear. She started muttering to herself, saying things that made no sense. I was petrified, scared she'd use the knife on me. I tried to talk to her calmly, told her to put the knife away. But she wouldn't listen, started getting more agitated. I saw my chance and ran out of the library, shouting for help. People stared, but no one moved to help. I didn't stop running until I got to my car. I called the police, told them everything. They said they'd look into it, but didn't find her. I never took her address, and they couldn't track her from Craigslist. I stopped tutoring in person from then and only done the online sessions. I'm a photographer. I put my portfolio up on Craigslist to find some freelance gigs. Got a response from a guy, let's call him Jason. He wanted some professional headshots for his LinkedIn profile. We agreed on a time and location, and I showed up with my gear. Jason seemed okay at first, polite and professional. We started the shoot. As we progressed, Jason's demeanor changed. He started making strange comments, like he was fixated on me. He'd say things like, "You're beautiful when you focus," and "I like your intensity." I tried to brush it off, thought maybe he was just trying to be friendly or complimentary. But it felt odd and made me uncomfortable. He asked me to take some photos of him in different poses. He began asking for more intimate shots, saying he wanted to capture different emotions. I felt uneasy but continued. That's when he started getting too close, invading my personal space. He kept touching my shoulder, my hair, trying to position me for the photos. I told him to back off, but he wouldn't listen. I told him I know how to take photos, so he should concentrate on posing and I will concentrate on taking the shots. He started suggesting bizarre and inappropriate poses, asking me if he can remove some clothing. I refused, feeling extremely uncomfortable by his demands. I told him I do not do that type of photography. He ignored my boundaries and began touching me more aggressively. I started feeling trapped and scared, not knowing what he'd do next. I tried to remain calm, packed up my gear, and told him the shoot was over. He got angry, demanding I take more photos. I stood my ground and left as quickly as I could. I reported the incident to Craigslist and to the authorities. They said they'd look into it but couldn't find him. I felt violated and shaken, never expecting a simple photo shoot to turn so disturbing. It's made me wary of taking freelance gigs now. I never imagined encountering someone so invasive and unpredictable. It was a terrifying experience, one that I don't want to relive. It was a typical evening, and I was browsing through Craigslist, looking for a good deal on a used phone. After a bit of scrolling, I stumbled upon an ad that seemed perfect. The phone was exactly what I wanted, and the price was a steal. I quickly messaged the seller, and to my surprise, they responded almost immediately. We arranged to meet in a parking lot near my place. As I pulled up, I noticed a guy leaning against a beat-up car, holding the phone in his hand. He looked a bit shifty, but I brushed it off, thinking he was probably just anxious about selling the device. I stepped out of my car, and we exchanged a few words before getting down to the deal. I handed him the cash, and he passed me the phone in a hurry. It was a swift transaction, or so I thought. As I drove back home, I felt a sense of satisfaction at the great deal I had gotten. But my joy was short-lived. When I reached home and started setting up the phone, something felt off. I noticed some strange messages in the inbox, messages that hinted at something shady. Curiosity got the better of me, and I dug deeper into the phone's files. That's when I stumbled upon a folder filled with personal photos and documents that clearly didn't belong to the previous owner. Panic set in. I realized I had inadvertently bought a stolen phone. Fear crept over me as I worried about the consequences of having possession of stolen goods. I debated what to do next, debating whether to turn it in or try to erase the evidence. As I grappled with my options, a sense of dread gnawed at me. My unease only intensified when I received a text message from an unknown number. The text was brief but chilling. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was a stark reminder of the potential danger I had landed myself in. My heart raced as I contemplated the implications of the situation. I didn't know who this person was or what they wanted, but their message struck fear into my core. I started receiving more messages, each one more threatening than the last. They seemed to know details about me, details that I hadn't shared with anyone. It felt like I was being watched, monitored by someone who was getting closer and closer. I tried to rationalize, thinking it could just be a prank or a bluff. But the fear of the unknown lingered, growing into a suffocating sense of dread. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being targeted, that someone was after me. Every little sound made me jump, and every unfamiliar face seemed like a potential threat. Sleep became elusive as my mind raced with scenarios of what might happen next. I felt like I was living in a constant state of paranoia, unable to find solace. I attempted to contact the seller to confront them about the phone, but their number was disconnected. It seemed like they had vanished into thin air, leaving me to deal with the mess they had created. Days passed, but the messages persisted, escalating in their intensity. Threats turned into warnings, making it clear that this was not something I could simply brush aside. I was in deep trouble, trapped in a nightmare I never saw coming. The fear started to consume me, affecting every aspect of my life. I constantly looked over my shoulder, afraid of what might happen next. It felt like I was in a game where the rules were unknown, and the stakes were my safety. I debated contacting the authorities, but the fear of being implicated for buying stolen goods paralyzed me. I felt trapped, with no way out, as if I had walked into a web of danger from which there was no escape. Every passing moment brought with it an overwhelming sense of dread. I felt like I was living on the edge, teetering between safety and an unknown threat that loomed over me like a dark cloud. The situation had spiraled into a nightmare, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being hunted. I didn't know who was after me or what they were capable of, and that uncertainty only fueled my terror. The fear of the unknown consumed me, turning every moment into a heart-pounding experience. I realized that I was on my own, facing a chilling reality of my own making, and there was no turning back. The dread continued to tighten its grip around me, leaving me in a state of constant panic. I was caught in a terrifying cycle, one that I had unknowingly walked into, and it seemed like there was no way out. I needed a lawnmower and decided to post an ad on Craigslist. It was a straightforward request for a used one in good condition, nothing fancy. Days passed, and my inbox remained quiet until I received a reply that caught my attention. The message was brief and cryptic, lacking any details about the lawnmower but expressing an urgent desire to meet. Curiosity piqued, I agreed to meet the person, hoping to strike a deal for the lawnmower. The reply provided an address, a secluded spot on the outskirts of town. It seemed odd, but I dismissed my reservations, chalking it up to someone just being cautious. The day arrived, and I drove to the location indicated in the message. It was an isolated area, surrounded by dense woods. There were no houses nearby, no signs of life, just an eerie silence. As I stepped out of my car, a sense of unease settled in. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to turn back, but the anticipation of getting a good deal pushed me forward. I noticed a figure standing near a large tree, partially hidden in the shadows. It was a tall, slender figure, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured their face. Something about their demeanor felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I called out, announcing my arrival, and the figure motioned for me to approach. As I got closer, I noticed the person's tense posture. They seemed jittery, their hands fidgeting inside their pockets. The uneasy feeling grew stronger, and I began to regret my decision to come here alone. Ignoring the feeling of unease, I greeted them and inquired about the lawnmower. The figure responded in a low, muffled voice, barely audible. They avoided my questions, instead, insisting on showing me something they had in their possession. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity and a sense of obligation made me stay. They reached into their pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a cloth. They unfolded it slowly, revealing a set of rusty, stained tools items that looked more suited for something sinister than yard work. My heart began to race, and I took a step back, my mind spinning with alarm. Before I could react, the figure lunged forward, their intentions now crystal clear. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, attempting to flee. The figure pursued, their movements swift and predatory. I fumbled for my car keys, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I managed to reach my car and hastily locked myself in. The figure banged on the windows, their face still hidden beneath the hood. Their voice turned hostile, demanding I hand over my belongings. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but instinct kicked in, and I hit the gas, speeding away from the terrifying encounter. Shaken and terrified, I drove to the nearest police station and reported the incident. The authorities promised to investigate, but warned me about the risks of these online dealings. They urged caution and emphasized the dangers of trusting strangers on the internet. The encounter haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, the sense of impending danger lingering in the air. I couldn't help but wonder what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The chilling realization that I narrowly escaped a potentially perilous situation haunted my thoughts. That experience left me shaken, my trust in online transactions shattered. I had been desperately looking for a job for weeks. Bills were piling up, and my savings were running dry. Then, I stumbled upon a job ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. It was offering an attractive salary for what appeared to be a simple office assistant role. The ad didn't specify much, but it mentioned immediate start and competitive pay. Desperation pushed me to apply without giving it much thought. Surprisingly, I received a quick response, and the interview was scheduled for the next day. Excitement mingled with anxiety as I dressed in my best attire, eager for a fresh start. The location seemed a bit odd, an old industrial area on the outskirts of town, but I didn't think much of it. I needed this job badly. Upon arriving at the address, my heart sank. The building looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a rusty sign hanging askew. Doubt crept in, but the thought of a paycheck overruled my better judgment. I knocked on the door, and it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. I hesitantly stepped inside, calling out for anyone. The sound of my own voice echoed eerily through the corridor. As I ventured further in, I could hear faint whispers, which sent a chill down my spine. I contemplated leaving, but something compelled me to stay. Finally, I reached what appeared to be an office. A disheveled man sat behind a cluttered desk, his eyes scrutinizing me intensely. He welcomed me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, making my stomach churn with unease. The interview was odd, to say the least. The questions were vague and unrelated to the job I applied for. Red flags flashed in my mind, but my desperation clouded my judgment. The man abruptly stood up, shaking my hand, and declared that I got the job. I was relieved yet unnerved by his sudden decision. My first day started, and it was nothing like I expected. There were no other employees, just me and the unsettling man. He assigned me tasks that had nothing to do with the job description. My gut told me something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Days passed, and the tasks became increasingly peculiar. I was asked to sort through old files, most of which seemed irrelevant. The office felt more like a storage room filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling. Curiosity pushed me to peek inside one of the boxes, and what I saw left me frozen in terror. The box contained photographs of people I recognized, people who had gone missing. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. I had stumbled upon something sinister, something beyond my worst nightmares. Before I could process what I had found, the man stormed into the room, his expression a mix of anger and panic. He locked eyes with me, and I knew I had made a grave mistake. He muttered something about confidentiality, and I knew I had to escape. I made a run for it, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. Adrenaline fueled my sprint as I frantically searched for an exit. Panic clouded my vision, and my heart pounded violently in my chest. The building felt like a maze, every turn leading me deeper into the unknown. I could hear him getting closer, his breath hot on my neck. Fear consumed me as I desperately searched for a way out. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, and the walls felt like they were closing in on me. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself outside. Gasping for breath, I sprinted towards my car, not daring to look back. I peeled out of the parking lot, my mind racing with what I had witnessed. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. The terror of that day haunted me. I reported the incident to the authorities, but they found nothing in the abandoned building. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a horrifying fate. The days that followed were riddled with paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Every sound made me jump, and every stranger felt like a potential threat. The job ad was gone from Craigslist, as if it had never existed. It left me with an unsettling sense of dread, wondering how many others had fallen into the same trap. I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, haunted by the realization that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. The experience left a scar on my psyche. I couldn't trust easily, always questioning people's intentions. The job that seemed like a lifeline turned out to be a nightmare that shook me to the core. I entered a raffle on Craigslist. It seemed legit, offering a big prize, a weekend stay at a secluded cabin. I never win anything, so when I got the email saying I'd won, I was thrilled. The instructions were simple. Go to a specific address and pick up the keys from a locked box. They didn't provide much detail, but hey, free weekend getaway, right? The drive was long, took me through winding roads and dense woods. The place was supposed to be serene, but it felt eerie as I drove up. The cabin was far from any other homes, isolated in the woods. I had mixed feelings, but a free trip's a free trip, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the musty smell and the chill in the air. The place looked okay, but felt strange, like someone had just left. Furniture was covered in sheets, and dust coated almost everything. I tried to shake off the unease. It was a free weekend away after all. I unpacked, checked out the rooms, and then decided to go for a walk in the woods. As I wandered, the woods felt dense and oppressive. The silence was eerie, no bird chirps or rustling leaves. The place was way too quiet, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should be. That night, I heard noises outside, footsteps, twigs snapping. I tried to brush it off as an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, things got weirder. I found scratch marks on the cabin door, like someone tried to force their way in. The unease crept in again. I decided to cut my trip short. But when I went to leave, the keys were missing. I searched everywhere, turning the cabin upside down. They were nowhere to be found. Panic started setting in. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. I was stuck, alone, in the middle of nowhere, without a way to leave. The isolation and the weirdness of the place were suffocating. I went back outside, feeling exposed and vulnerable. That's when I saw something, figures, shadows lurking in the woods. They were there, watching me, but whenever I looked directly, they vanished. The hours passed slowly, and the night crept in. Every creak and groan of the cabin felt like something or someone was trying to get inside. The scratching returned, louder and more persistent. It echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. I bolted the doors, but the sounds continued. I couldn't sleep. I sat there in the darkness, listening to every little noise. I felt like I was being hunted, like something sinister lurked just beyond sight. Then, I heard whispers, unintelligible, eerie whispers coming from all around. My heart raced, and I felt sheer terror. There was no explanation, no rationalization for what was happening. I wanted to leave, to escape that place. But I was trapped, surrounded by the unknown. Fear consumed me. Morning finally came, and I made a run for it, leaving everything behind. I didn't look back, I just needed to get out of there. I reported it to the authorities, but they found nothing, no evidence of anyone or anything. It was as if the place was hiding its secrets, as if it never wanted to be discovered. To this day, I still can't shake off the fear and the feeling of being watched. That cabin and those woods, I don't know what they were hiding, but I never want to find out. The raffle prize turned into a nightmare I'd never forget. I found a job listing on Craigslist. It was a good gig, so I applied. They called me for an interview at a cafe downtown. When I got there, everything seemed normal. The interviewer was nice, asked basic questions about my skills and experience. They said they'd let me know soon. A few days later, I got an email saying I got the job. I was happy. It was a decent paying gig. But then, things took a weird turn. I got an email from an unknown address. They knew personal stuff about me, stuff that I hadn't shared with anyone. They wanted money, threatening to expose my personal info if I didn't pay up. I was freaked out. How did they get my info? I ignored the first few emails, hoping they'd just stop. But they didn't. They kept sending more, getting more aggressive each time. I blocked the email, but they found ways to contact me through different addresses. They even sent letters to my house. I felt like I was being watched, like they were always right behind me. I didn't tell anyone. I was too scared and embarrassed. I couldn't focus on work, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching my every move. One night, I heard a knock at my door. It was late, past midnight. I peeked out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing there. My heart raced and fear gripped me. I didn't dare open the door. The person started yelling, threatening to expose everything if I didn't come out. I stayed quiet, hoping they'd go away. But they didn't. They kept shouting, banging on the door. I called the cops, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. The officers said they couldn't do much without evidence. The harassment continued. They sent more threatening messages, saying they knew where I lived and that they'd come back. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Every little noise made me jump, thinking it was them. Days turned into weeks, and I was on edge all the time. I tried changing my number, my email, but they always found a way to contact me. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. My heart raced, and I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly made my way downstairs. I saw a shadowy figure in my living room, going through my stuff. Panic flooded me, and I froze. They turned around, and for a moment, our eyes met. I swung the bat, hitting them square in the chest. They fell, and I ran for the phone, calling the cops again. When the police arrived, they found the person lying on the floor, unconscious. Turns out, it was the same person behind the threats, trying to rob me. They arrested the intruder, but I couldn't shake off the fear and the feeling of violation. My safe space was shattered. It took me a long time to feel secure again, but the fear of someone watching me, lurking in the shadows, still lingers. I found a listing on Craigslist for a used car. The ad had pictures, a decent price, and the car looked good. I contacted the seller, and we arranged to meet at a parking lot. When I arrived, I noticed something weird. The parking lot seemed deserted, empty with no one around. I double-checked the address from the ad, and it matched. But there was no sign of the seller or the car. I waited for a while, feeling uneasy. Something felt off, like I shouldn't be there. But I really needed a car, and this one seemed like a good deal. After a few minutes, I decided to call the seller. The phone rang, but no one answered. I called again and again, but it went straight to voicemail each time. I was about to leave when I heard a sound coming from the far end of the parking lot. It sounded like footsteps, faint but distinct. I froze, wondering if it was the seller finally arriving. I waited for a few more minutes, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It wasn't the seller, it was someone else. The figure approached slowly, and as they got closer, I realized something was very wrong. They looked disheveled, clothes torn and dirty. Their eyes had a vacant, almost haunted look. I stepped back, feeling a surge of fear. The person didn't seem right, their presence was unsettling. They muttered something incoherent and gestured towards an old, abandoned building nearby. I didn't understand what they wanted, but I felt a chill down my spine. I decided to leave, but when I turned around, I saw more figures emerging from the darkness. Panic washed over me. I felt trapped, surrounded by these strange and unsettling individuals. They started moving closer, their movements erratic and unpredictable. I sprinted towards my car, my heart racing. I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to unlock the door. The figures were getting closer, their murmurs growing louder. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me. I started the engine and drove off as fast as I could, leaving the bizarre and eerie scene behind. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the figures standing in the distance, watching me drive away. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread and confusion. I didn't understand what had just happened. Why would the seller arrange a meeting at such a desolate and creepy place? And who were those people? I reported the incident to the police, but they couldn't find anything at the location. It was as if the place had never been inhabited, no signs of recent human activity. The experience left me shaken and paranoid. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't left in time. The whole thing felt like a nightmare, something out of a horror movie. I was looking for a nice, secluded camping spot for the weekend. I found this ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. It promised a peaceful and isolated area surrounded by nature. The location was about an hour's drive away. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet. It was supposed to be a camping spot, but there was no sign of any other campers. I felt a bit uneasy, but I shrugged it off and started setting up my tent. As I explored the area, I noticed something odd in the distance. There were other tents, but they seemed abandoned. They were torn and tattered, and some had holes in them. It looked like the campsite had been deserted for a while. I found it strange that the ad mentioned nothing about these other campers. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I convinced myself that it was probably just a forgotten area. As night fell, I made a fire and tried to relax. But something didn't feel right. The atmosphere was tense, and the silence was deafening. It felt like something was watching me from the shadows. I heard noises coming from the direction of the old, torn tents. It sounded like rustling and whispering. My heart started racing, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way towards the abandoned tents. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. I shone my light on one of the tents, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. There were markings and scribbles all over the fabric. It looked like someone had been writing or drawing something, but it was chaotic and indecipherable. It sent shivers down my spine. I decided to leave the area and head back to my tent. But as I turned around, I saw figures moving in the darkness. I couldn't make out their faces, but they seemed to be coming closer. Fear surged through me, and I ran back to my tent. I zipped it shut and tried to block out the noise. But I could hear footsteps and whispers outside. I felt trapped and vulnerable. I didn't dare peek outside. The fear paralyzed me. I stayed awake the whole night, listening to the eerie sounds around me. It felt like an eternity before the morning light finally broke through. I gathered my things quickly, not bothering to pack my tent properly. I just wanted to get out of there. As I left, I glanced back at the abandoned campsite, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched and followed. It was like the eyes from the night were still on me, haunting my every move. When I reached the town, I stopped at a diner to catch my breath. I tried to make sense of what had happened. The whole experience was terrifying, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread and unease. I later found out from the locals that the camping spot I went to was abandoned years ago after some tragic incident. No one knew what happened exactly, but it was enough to keep people away. I never went back to that area again. I decided to sell my old dinner set on Craigslist. It was in good condition, and I thought someone might be interested in buying it. I posted some pictures and details, and soon enough, I got a few inquiries. One email stood out. It was from a potential buyer, but something felt off. The messages were cryptic, almost like codes or hints. They seemed interested in the set, but their language was strange and unsettling. It made me feel uneasy. They were insistent on meeting in a secluded area for the exchange. That was a red flag. It didn't make sense for something as simple as a dinner set. I felt a sense of foreboding, like something wasn't right. As the messages continued, they became more cryptic and ominous. It was as if the buyer was hinting at something hidden beneath the surface. I couldn't understand what they wanted or what they were trying to convey. Despite my growing unease, I decided to meet the buyer. I don't know why. Maybe I was curious or just wanted to figure out what was going on. I arranged a meeting at a nearby park, a public place, just to be safe. I arrived at the park and scanned the area. There was no one around. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the person I'd been corresponding with. The stranger approached with an unsettling smile. They didn't seem right. Their eyes held an unsettling glint. I felt a knot form in my stomach as they began talking. They spoke in riddles, hinting at something dangerous. I couldn't make sense of their words. It was like they were speaking in a code, dropping hints about some hidden agenda. Fear gripped me, and I wanted to leave, but something held me back. The stranger's behavior became more erratic and unpredictable. They started mentioning strange things, asking me odd questions that had nothing to do with the dinner set. It felt like they were trying to probe into something deeper, something personal. My instinct screamed at me to get away. I made an excuse and hastily left the park. The encounter left me shaken and frightened. The cryptic messages and the stranger's unsettling demeanor lingered in my mind, haunting me with unanswered questions. I deleted the ad and blocked the email address. But the fear persisted. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was tracking my every move. The whole experience was chilling, and I couldn't shake off the sense of impending danger. I tried to forget about it, but the messages haunted me. They were vague but carried an ominous undertone. I felt like I had stumbled into something sinister, something that I couldn't comprehend. Days passed, but I couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. I started noticing strange cars parked outside my house. It felt like someone was watching me, waiting for an opportunity. The fear consumed me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate. I felt trapped and paranoid. I called the police, but without any concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. I decided to leave town for a while, seeking refuge with a friend in another city. I hoped the distance would help me feel safe again. But the fear followed me like a shadow, and I couldn't shake it off. Even in a new place, I couldn't escape the sense of impending doom. I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the worst. It was a nightmare that wouldn't end. Eventually, the messages stopped and the strange cars disappeared. But the experience left me scarred. I never sold anything on Craigslist again, and I became hypervigilant, always wary of any cryptic communication. The encounter had been surreal and terrifying. It was a reminder of the dark and dangerous aspects of the online world, where seemingly innocent exchanges could turn into nightmares. I decided to sell my old laptop on Craigslist. It was still functional, but I needed an upgrade, and I figured someone else could use it. I posted the ad, and soon enough, I received a message from a potential buyer. The buyer seemed polite and interested in the laptop. They asked for the address to pick it up. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a typical transaction. The day of the exchange arrived, and the buyer said they'd be coming alone. But when I opened the door, I was startled to see not one, but two people standing there. The buyer was there with another person I hadn't expected. They were both polite and smiled, but something felt off. The stranger with the buyer didn't say much, just stood there silently, casting furtive glances around. I tried to maintain composure and led them inside to complete the transaction. But as we sat in the living room, I noticed the stranger's eyes wandering, scanning the room as if looking for something. The buyer kept engaging me in conversation, distracting me while the other person stayed silent, observing everything. It was eerie, their presence casting a shadow over what was supposed to be a simple sale. I felt a sense of unease growing within me. There was something about the way they both acted that made me uneasy. My gut instincts screamed at me that something wasn't right. As the buyer inspected the laptop, the stranger's behavior became more peculiar. They started pacing around the room, looking at things, and occasionally whispering something to the buyer. The atmosphere became tense, and I started to feel a rising sense of dread. I wanted the exchange to be over. I made up an excuse, saying I had another appointment, and quickly wrapped up the sale. I felt relieved when they finally left, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something sinister about the entire encounter. Later that night, I heard noises outside my house. I peeked through the window and saw the two strangers loitering nearby, their figures illuminated by the dim streetlights. My heart raced and fear gripped me. What were they doing outside my house? Why hadn't they left? The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the strangers were gone. The officers assured me they'd patrol the area, but they couldn't do much without any evidence of wrongdoing. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept checking the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The slightest noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The next day, I received a string of strange messages on my phone. They were cryptic, hinting at things they shouldn't know. I felt a cold sweat break out as I read them. The messages were vague but carried an ominous undertone. It was as if they knew personal details about me, things I hadn't shared with anyone. Panic set in, and I started to feel like I was being targeted. I deleted the ad from Craigslist and blocked the numbers, hoping to put an end to the distressing messages. But they continued, each one becoming more unsettling than the last. I considered changing my number, but the fear of being tracked or followed persisted. I felt trapped, like there was no escape from the relentless harassment. Days turned into weeks, and the messages didn't stop. I felt like I was losing my mind, the constant fear gnawing away at me. I was paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, expecting the strangers to reappear at any moment. I sought help from friends and family, but they couldn't offer much except reassurance. They suggested I file a police report, but without solid evidence, it seemed futile. I lived in a constant state of terror, the fear consuming me day and night. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything else. It felt like my life had been invaded, and I couldn't shake off the nightmare. Eventually, the messages slowed down, but the fear persisted. The encounter had left me scarred, a constant reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows of seemingly ordinary transactions. I became hypervigilant, always cautious of any new interactions, always wary of who might be watching or tracking me. The encounter had shattered my sense of security, leaving behind a chilling reminder of a nightmarish experience that I couldn't quite escape. I had this old guitar that I never used, so I decided to sell it on Craigslist. A guy messaged me about it, and we arranged to meet in a public place to make the exchange. When we met, he seemed nice at first, but as soon as we started discussing the price, things turned sour. He became aggressive, insisting on a much lower price than what we agreed upon online. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He got louder and more intimidating. I didn't want any trouble, so I tried to end the negotiation and leave. But he wasn't having it. He blocked my way and demanded that I sell it for his price. I felt trapped and scared, not knowing how to handle the situation. People nearby started to notice, and I felt embarrassed and afraid. I tried to stay calm and defuse the situation, but he kept pushing and getting more aggressive. I offered to reduce the price a little, hoping he would calm down, but it only made things worse. He became even angrier, yelling and making threats. I realized that I had to get out of there, so I made an excuse and hurried away, leaving the guitar behind. I just wanted to escape the tense and scary situation. Later that night, I received a barrage of angry messages from the guy, threatening me and saying he knew where I lived. I tried to block him, but he kept creating new accounts to continue the harassment. I felt my heart race every time my phone buzzed, dreading another message from him. I couldn't sleep, fearing that he might show up at my doorstep. Days passed, and the messages kept coming. I felt helpless and terrified, wondering if this guy would actually come to my house. I considered going to the police, but I didn't have much evidence to show them. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I was outside. I avoided going home directly from work, taking longer routes just to make sure I wasn't followed. The fear was suffocating. I didn't feel safe anymore. I confided in friends, but they couldn't do much except offer support and advice to stay cautious. I tried changing my number and deleting my Craigslist account, hoping to stop the harassment, but it didn't help. The aggressive messages persisted, each one more threatening than the last. I felt like I was being watched, like he was always lurking in the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of figures in the distance, wondering if it was him. My nerves were shot, and I felt constant dread. The nights were the worst. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps approaching. I'd lie awake, clutching my phone, afraid to sleep. It became an obsession, checking the locks multiple times a day, looking out the window constantly, living in a state of constant fear. My life had turned into a nightmare. I contemplated moving, but I was scared that he might find out my new address somehow. I felt like I was living in a prison of fear and uncertainty. Eventually, the messages slowed down, but the fear lingered. I was always on edge, waiting for the next threat to arrive. It felt like I was being tormented, the aggressive encounter turning my life upside down. I wished I'd never posted that ad on Craigslist. The encounter had unleashed a terror that I couldn't shake off, a relentless fear that haunted me every day and night. I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for someone to fix a leak in my basement. A guy responded, saying he was experienced and could do the job for a reasonable price. I agreed and set up a time for him to come over. On the day of the appointment, he arrived on time and seemed normal at first. He introduced himself as Mark and went down to the basement to check the leak. As he worked, I went about my business around the house. But something about him felt off. He seemed overly curious about personal things, asking questions that didn't relate to the job. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he was just trying to be friendly. But then, I noticed him snooping around areas that had nothing to do with the repair. It made me uneasy. I confronted him, asking why he was wandering around. He laughed it off, saying he was just making sure everything was okay. But his demeanor was unsettling, and I felt a chill run down my spine. As he continued to work, I noticed him glancing around the house more often, almost like he was sizing it up. It was as if he was interested in more than just fixing the leak. I kept watching him from a distance, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. He was acting strange, fidgety, and his eyes seemed to dart around, almost like he was planning something. My gut told me something wasn't right, and I started regretting hiring him. But I didn't want to confront him again or escalate the situation. When he finished, he presented me with a bill that seemed way higher than what we agreed upon. I tried to argue, but he became aggressive, insisting on the payment. I reluctantly paid him just to get him out of my house. But as he left, he gave me a chilling smile that sent shivers down my spine. Later that night, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the basement, and the leak was fixed, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mark's odd behavior. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, feeling paranoid that he might have made copies of the keys or left something behind. The next day, I noticed some of my valuables were missing. It hit me like a ton of bricks Mark had stolen from me while pretending to fix the leak. I panicked and called the police, explaining the situation. They came over and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. I felt violated and terrified, knowing that someone had been in my home with nefarious intentions. In the following days, I installed security cameras and changed all the locks, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I kept thinking about what Mark might have done or if he would come back. I couldn't sleep, afraid that he might return to my house or target me in some other way. I lived in constant fear, jumping at every sound and constantly looking over my shoulder. The trust one once had in people was shattered, and I felt like my safe haven had been invaded. I avoided using Craigslist or any similar services, afraid of encountering someone like Mark again. The experience left me traumatized, and I couldn't shake off the paranoia. I tried to move on, but the fear lingered. The thought of someone exploiting my trust and invading my home haunted me every day. It was a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, a chilling encounter that shook me to my core. I saw a bike advertised on Craigslist. It was exactly what I wanted, so I contacted the seller, a guy named Tom. He seemed nice and agreed to meet at a local park for the sale. When I arrived, Tom was there, waiting. He seemed normal, friendly even. We chatted for a bit, and then I gave him the money for the bike. He handed it over, and everything seemed fine. I took the bike home, excited to ride it. But things started feeling weird after that. I'd see a car parked down the street, and whenever I went out, I felt like I was being watched. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination. But it kept happening. Sometimes I hear footsteps behind me while riding the bike, but whenever I look back, there was no one there. One day, when I was cleaning the bike, I noticed something odd. There was a small device attached to the underside of the seat. I didn't know what it was, but it looked like some kind of tracker. I panicked. Why would someone put a tracker on the bike? It hit me then, maybe Tom, the guy I bought it from, was following me. I didn't know what to do. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that I might be in danger. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, even when I was at home. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I removed the device from the bike and threw it away. But that didn't stop the feeling of being followed. I started taking different routes, looking over my shoulder constantly. The fear of someone stalking me consumed my thoughts, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Then one night, I received a text from an unknown number. It said, "I can see you." My heart raced. I didn't reply, but I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I called the police, explaining the situation. They told me they couldn't do much without evidence. I felt helpless, like I was on my own. I changed my routine, trying to be more cautious. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being followed. I decided to confront Tom. I went back to the park where we met, hoping to find him. But he wasn't there. I felt a knot in my stomach, wondering if he was watching me from somewhere nearby. I reported the incident to Craigslist, but there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to block Tom and file a police report. I blocked his number and social media profiles, but the fear lingered. I couldn't sleep, thinking about what Tom might do next or if he was still tracking me somehow. Every time I saw a car parked outside my house or heard footsteps behind me, I felt a surge of panic. I didn't feel safe anymore, even in my own home. I started considering moving, but the thought of Tom finding me again terrified me even more. I felt trapped, like there was no escape from this nightmare. I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder. The bike I bought with excitement had become a source of terror, a link to the person who was stalking me. I tried to resume my normal life, but the fear never left me. I kept wondering if I'd ever be able to feel safe again or if Tom would come back. The experience changed me. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking for any signs of danger. The once enjoyable bike rides turned into moments of anxiety and paranoia. I never found out for sure if Tom was the one stalking me, but the fear of being watched never faded. It was a terrifying encounter that left me feeling vulnerable and scared, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being hunted. I posted an ad for my old chess set on Craigslist. It was a beautiful, expensive set that I didn't use anymore, so I thought selling it would be a good idea. A guy named Mark contacted me, saying he was interested and wanted to buy it. We exchanged messages, and Mark asked if I could drop the set off at his place. I was a bit hesitant at first, but he seemed genuine, so I agreed. We arranged to meet at his address the next day. On the day of the drop-off, I headed to Mark's place. When I arrived, I knocked on the door, and he welcomed me in. He looked normal, but something felt off right from the start. I handed him the chess set, and he examined it closely. After a few moments, he said he wouldn't pay for it. I was taken aback and reminded him that we had agreed on a price. But Mark refused, demanding to have it for free. I stood my ground, refusing to give it away for nothing. That's when things took a turn. Mark's demeanor changed abruptly, and he got aggressive. He started yelling, demanding I leave the set and get out of his house. I tried to reason with him, but it was no use. He was furious, and I began to feel uneasy. His behavior was erratic, and I realized I needed to leave before things got worse. I grabbed the set and rushed towards the door. As I was leaving, Mark shouted threateningly, saying he would come after me if I didn't leave the set behind. I hurriedly made my way out, feeling a sense of dread. Once I was out of his house, I took a deep breath, relieved to be away from his aggressive behavior. But the fear lingered. I was worried that Mark might come after me, and the encounter had left me shaken. I decided to report the incident to Craigslist, hoping they could do something about it. I blocked Mark's number and email, trying to distance myself from the unsettling encounter. However, things didn't end there. I started receiving strange messages from unknown numbers, some threatening, others just unnerving. It seemed like someone was trying to intimidate me. The thought of Mark knowing my contact details made me paranoid. I felt like I was being watched, and the constant fear of someone lurking around kept me on edge. I considered contacting the police, but I didn't have concrete evidence of any crime. I felt helpless, not knowing what to do to make the fear go away. The whole experience haunted me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being targeted by Mark or whoever was behind those messages. I didn't feel safe, even in my own home. I became increasingly paranoid, constantly checking my surroundings, making sure I wasn't being followed. The idea that someone could be watching my every move scared me to the core. Sleep became elusive. I was on edge all the time, fearing that something terrible might happen. The chess set, which I thought would bring in some extra cash, had turned into a source of fear and anxiety. I reached out to friends, asking them to stay over or accompany me when going out. I felt vulnerable and exposed, like I was being hunted. Days turned into weeks, and the fear didn't subside. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, and the unsettling messages continued to arrive sporadically. The incident with Mark had turned my life upside down. I became withdrawn, avoiding public places and constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't find peace of mind, always wondering if Mark or someone associated with him was still monitoring me. It was a terrifying encounter that made me question my safety and left me feeling helpless and vulnerable.